Send this to the boys at the station. Got this black guy tied to a pole like a damn monkey. Hilarious." The words spat out from Officer Travis Dorn's mouth, followed by a smug laugh that echoed through the cold morning air on Cherry Street. Isaiah Carter, a war veteran who once risked his life to save fellow soldiers under gunfire, now stood zip-tied to a utility pole by two disgraceful cops. Turned into a sick joke, they didn't know he was the father of Malik Carter, the newly appointed police chief. Will they be held accountable? Which state are you in? If someone you love were treated like that, would you stay silent or burn the whole system down? Isaiah Carter walked out of the familiar barber shop on Cherry Street with a slow stride, his left shoulder slightly tilted, a lasting imprint from the battlefield still present in his steps. He wore a checkered shirt with sleeves rolled up to the elbows, his silver hair neatly trimmed, and his face lean yet alert. This was the neighborhood where people had known him for years, where every step he took still carried a quiet respect, even if few remembered what he had once done for this country. As he turned into a quiet corner, a patrol car pulled up close to the curb, blocking his path. Two officers stepped out, uniforms crisp, eyes scanning swiftly as if they had already locked on their target. The taller one, sluggish in gait but sharp-eyed, took the lead. "Sorry, sir, we need to do a quick check. There have been reports of unusual behavior in the area," said Travis Dorn, in a flat tone tinged with unspoken authority. Isaiah remained still, calmly reaching into his back pocket for his wallet, handing over both his ID and veteran card, which he always carried. He said nothing, meeting Dorn's gaze without showing any discomfort. Bryce Keller, the second officer, didn't ask a thing. He stood back, tapping away on his phone. His fingers moved swiftly over the screen, occasionally glancing up at Isaiah and then back at his partner. A light breeze stirred, scattering dry leaves across the road. The street was empty. No surveillance cameras pointed at that stretch of pavement. Dorn flipped through the documents, glancing at Isaiah with a cryptic smile. "How long have you lived around here?" he asked, then continued without waiting for an answer. "You usually walk this route every week? Same time?" Isaiah nodded, brief and firm, a reply with no qualifiers, giving no room for circular logic. But Dorn didn't seem satisfied. He folded the papers and tucked them into his chest pocket. "You're too calm. Makes us wonder if you're hiding something." The words came out like a whisper, but they were clearly a test. Behind him, Keller began recording with his phone, disguising the act with a casual stance, shoulders tilted slightly. The camera aimed, but not openly raised. Isaiah's expression remained calm, revealing no emotion. He didn't respond, but his eyes moved slowly, enough for Dorn to notice that he was studying their every move. He wasn't afraid, he just hadn't chosen to react yet. Silence in that moment wasn't fear. It was a man using his presence as a shield, knowing the language of the body could speak louder than words spoken in haste. The air between the three men thickened. Dorn stepped closer, his tone slower but still challenging. "If you've got nothing to hide, why not stand here a few more minutes for additional checks?" The shift in atmosphere didn't come from his voice, but from what it implied, an undercurrent of manipulation. That sentence alone veered everything off its natural course, and Isaiah knew it. Dorn took a step back, quickly scanning the area before tilting his head toward Keller. Their exchange was silent and brief. No words were needed. Keller moved behind Isaiah, reached into his side pocket and pulled out a stiff zip tie. The clicking sound it made echoed strangely in the already tense silence. Isaiah turned his head instinctively, eyes following Keller's hand. His voice was steady, not loud, but clear. "I've presented my documents. I haven't done anything suspicious. What's the reason for this?" Dorn squinted and shrugged. "Precaution, simple procedure." Isaiah was turned toward a nearby utility pole. His hands were pulled forward, wrists pressed together. Keller smirked as he looped the zip tie with practiced ease. The plastic bit into his dark skin, tightening with a faint rasp when the lock clicked shut. "Stay right there. Looks good," Keller said, while Dorn pulled out his phone and opened the camera. He angled it to capture Isaiah, the pole, and the restraints all within frame. Isaiah stared straight into the lens, unblinking. His deep brown eyes reflected the late afternoon sun, heavy and cold, with not a trace of fear. Dorn lowered his head and chuckled, muttering, "Sending this to the guys at the station. Black man tied to a pole like a damn monkey. Hilarious." His shadow stretched alongside the poles across the pavement. Across the street, behind the frosted glass of a convenience store, someone pulled out a phone but didn't step outside. The wind picked up again. Sweat trickled from Isaiah's temple, but he remained still. His shirt was askew from the tight hold on his arms, chest rising slightly with each breath. He said nothing more. Anger didn't show, but hurt clung visibly to his dignified stance. Dorn and Keller laughed as they returned to their patrol car. They didn't look back. The street stayed quiet. Few vehicles passed. A distant siren echoed from the other direction, blending into the breeze like this was just another day in this place. Isaiah stayed there a few minutes longer. He turned slowly, raising his restrained hands with effort, reaching for his front pocket. His thin fingers fumbled for his phone, unlocked it, and a familiar number appeared on the screen. Without hesitation, he raised it to his ear, waiting for a signal. "Malik, it's your father." The words were short, but the tone carried the weight of everything he had just endured. Bare, compressed, delivered like a message that needed no explanation. Isaiah wasn't asking for advice. He called so his son would know. The time had come to begin. Inside the freshly painted second-floor office, Malik Carter removed the badge from his collar and placed it on the dark wooden desk. The room still carried a mix of fresh paint and old file smells, as if the building's long history was trying to force him into its worn rhythm. A newly appointed police chief, black, 36 years old, now walked the halls of a department where no one who looked like him had ever held this position. The glances from some officers earlier that morning said nothing, but Malik understood clearly. He wasn't welcome, merely watched. His phone vibrated in his pocket. He recognized his father's number. The voice on the other end came slowly, with something off about it, even though the words were few. Malik asked urgently, but the silence that followed said more. He stood motionless for a moment, fingers gripping the edge of the phone, eyes distant, locked on the half-open window frame. Less than a minute later, Malik left his office and moved quickly down the hallway. He didn't call for anyone to follow or ask for approval. The internal surveillance room was on the ground floor, behind a secure door that few visited. He knocked and was met by the on-duty technician, a scruffy-haired young man named Decker. The sight of the new chief made the technician freeze momentarily. "I need access to all body cam footage from Dorn and Keller's shift today. Everything." Decker blinked, flustered, glancing at the screen. "The system is still syncing to the central server. It'll take a few hours." Malik's tone didn't change, but his eyes spoke more clearly than words. "I don't need the synced copy. I want the raw feed from the backup device, in real time." The tension in the small room thickened. Decker turned the screen, typed in a few commands, then stepped aside. Malik sat down, eyes locked on the multi-angle feed now compiling. One of them showed a frame that sent a chill down his spine. A faded checkered shirt, a slightly tilted left shoulder, a shadow stretched crooked under the afternoon sun. The video played back at high speed, then slowed to real time. There were no raised voices, no resistance, just a dull exchange steered entirely by one side. Isaiah stood still between two officers. His gestures were calm, his gaze never lowered, but his face in the frame looked like someone long accustomed to being judged through warped lenses. A voice surfaced, barely audible under ambient noise. "Sending this to the boys at the station, funny as hell." A faint chuckle followed. Malik inhaled sharply and closed his eyes. One hand clenched the desk edge so hard his knuckles turned white. No one spoke. Decker had stepped out, leaving him alone to face the truth that had just unfolded. That was his father. No title, no badge. A man standing in the street, bound and filmed for amusement. No one knew who that man was, but Malik did, and from that moment on he understood. Some matters couldn't be handled through standard procedure. These were things that needed to start immediately, from right here. The surveillance room was now empty except for Malik. Overhead lights reflected softly off the tiled floor and onto his face, mirrored in the black screen. He manually rewound the footage, not to verify details but to watch again, to hold himself accountable. Every movement in the frame pressed heavier against his chest, each second peeling away the professional veneer he had worn all morning. The man in the video showed no dramatic reaction, but that very calmness made it harder to breathe. It was the same gaze he had seen throughout his childhood, when his father sat silently in the kitchen after long days of labor. He had never been one to speak much, but the lessons were never in the words. Malik remembered a rainy night when, as a child, he asked, "What if someone's wrong but stronger than us?" His father had simply replied, "You need to know how to stay still when everything else is falling apart." That same posture, the one so familiar, was now bound, exposed in the street, turned into entertainment. An internal staffer knocked and entered, placing a file on the desk before standing silently. He asked, cautiously, whether a crisis meeting should be called or if the town council should be notified. Malik glanced at him, then turned back to the screen. "Not yet," he said, short and firm. He accessed the system interface, entered his administrator code, and flagged the video as top-level security. In the notes field, he typed, "Request to protect the victim's identity, pending internal investigation order." The cursor blinked a few times before disappearing as he hit save. As Malik exited the surveillance room, he passed a hallway lined with unresolved internal complaints. The names stared back like quiet reminders, heavy despite their silence. Dorn and Keller were both on the list. Each name had blank columns beside it under disciplinary action. Nothing resolved. No one is held accountable. He paused briefly, eyes fixed on the last column in Dorn's row, then moved on. Back in his office, Malik sat down and opened the left drawer. From it, he pulled a worn stack of papers, each sheet clipped with a rusted pin. It was a list Isaiah had given him years ago, a short record of names, people hurt by so-called routine stops. At the time, Malik had thought his father was clinging to old ghosts. Now, he read it differently. Not as a son, but as someone with the power to act. Some names matched current pending case files. Malik flipped through slowly, marking 3 of the most recent. Cases closed for insufficient evidence. Same reasons, same people. And now, his father. Not on paper, but in reality. He looked at the wooden wall across from him. The police chief's badge hung silently under the light. Leaning back, he tapped the desk gently. "You're not just a name in a video. You're the reason I'm here." The words came out softly, more a vow than a declaration, not meant for others, but loud enough that even he could not back away from it. The morning air clung damply to the old porch roof, the scent of wet soil lingering between the cracks of the brick courtyard. Isaiah sat on a long wooden bench in the backyard, gently turning the valve of the irrigation system, his eyes fixed on the garden beds ahead. His faded gray t-shirt was damp with sweat down the back, his rough hands smeared with bits of soil, yet still moved with the precision of someone once trained to handle a rifle on the battlefield. The soft crunch of tires on the driveway made him look up. A sleek black SUV came to a stop just outside the gate, its engine humming down before the door opened firmly. Travis Dorn stepped out first, shirt tucked in, polished leather shoes gleaming, an oddly refined look for a man more used to barking orders at people on the street. Bryce Keller followed, carrying a paper bag, his shoulders hunched as if bearing something heavier than duty. Last came Edward Lockridge, tall, with neatly combed salt and pepper hair, briefcase in hand, every step paced with the calculation of a seasoned lawyer. Isaiah didn't stand, nor did he invite them in. He turned back to the bench, wiping his hands with a cloth, waiting for someone to speak. Dorn broke the silence. "We're here to apologize for what happened the other day. Honestly, no one wanted it to turn out like that. Keller placed the paper bag on the weathered wooden table on the porch. Inside was a large envelope, thick, sealed with transparent tape. Lockridge offered a practiced smile, like someone negotiating an insurance settlement. "This is a private offer, no legal strings attached. We hope you'll consider keeping the matter personal, avoiding unnecessary public attention." Isaiah glanced at the bag, then looked up. His eyes showed no scrutiny, no anger, only the wary look of someone who'd seen too many apologies arrive long after the damage was done. Keller tried to chime in, his voice lower than usual. "It was really just a misunderstanding. We thought you were acting erratically. People make mistakes in the moment." The statement hung in the air. Isaiah braced his hands on his knees and sat upright. His voice was low and even, as if recounting something from long ago. "If I had been a white man, would you have cuffed me in the middle of the street like that?" Keller looked away. Dorn pressed his lips together. Lockridge, who had been about to speak, froze. The question needed no answer. The silence already had one. Wind rustled through the oak branches outside. Inside, the hum of the old air conditioner buzzed faintly, cutting into the quiet moment between the three men. Isaiah gently pushed the envelope forward. "I don't take anything from men who come to me out of fear, not remorse." Lockridge stepped forward, placing a release form on the table. "There are no conditions. We just want to move past this tension." Isaiah stood up. Though not physically imposing, he seemed to block the light behind him as he stood in the porch frame. "I don't want to see your regret. I want to see your change." Dorn lowered his gaze. Keller bowed his head, for once silent. Lockridge collected the document, adjusted his tie, and left without making promises. As the SUV drove off, Isaiah remained standing on the damp brick floor, eyes fixed on the gate as if waiting for something else. Not an apology, but a reckoning yet to come. Night settled over Macon, as it always did, quiet and heavy with moisture. In the small kitchen, a yellow bulb cast light over Isaiah's face as he sat with a cup of cold tea. Malik came in after finishing his day's work, tossed his jacket onto a chair, and sat across from him. Neither spoke immediately. Isaiah slid the cup toward his son. His voice was slow, as though narrating someone else's story. "They came this morning, with money and rehearsed apologies." Malik stayed silent, eyes attentive. Isaiah recounted everything, from beginning to end, in an even tone, without anger. When he finished, he looked directly at his son. "They weren't apologizing to me. They're afraid of you." That line echoed in Malik's mind the entire ride back to headquarters. Near midnight, he entered the central data room and activated the internal file management system. The glow from the screen lit up his tense face. Malik typed in key words: Dorn, Keller, complaints, internal investigation. The results loaded faster than expected. The top record was from 8 years ago, describing an incident where officers used excessive force on an elderly man at a local church. Case status: investigation suspended. Reason given as victim non-cooperative. He kept scrolling. The next was a complaint from a black woman who was stopped without cause and searched in broad daylight. The case was withdrawn 2 days later. Another involved a young man arrested for public disturbance, though the file lacked audio or video evidence. Outcome: insufficient grounds for administrative action, converted to internal warning. There were 7 cases in total. 4 were closed early, 2 withdrawn, and 1 deleted entirely from the system after 3 days. Every investigation form bore the same signature: T.H. Thomas Halpern. The former head of internal affairs was before Malik's appointment. Each report had the same closing remark: insufficient basis for disciplinary action, recommend verbal reminder. A repeated script, almost copy-pasted. Malik braced himself against the desk, staring at the stack of records on the screen. What he felt wasn't shock, but confirmation. Rumors he had heard from older staff, the hesitation in their voices whenever the inspector division was mentioned. It all formed a smooth, patterned cycle. And Isaiah Carter's name was simply the latest entry in a long-running file, older than his term in office. He opened the high-level control panel and accessed the data permissions. On the security interface, Malik marked all files related to Dorn and Keller for controlled access. From now on, every time those records were opened, they would require his personal approval. In the notes field, he typed, "All data related to these individuals must be thoroughly reviewed. Temporarily suspend all external access from non-command personnel." By the time he left the room, it was late. The night air was cool, but his chest still felt like it carried stones. Dorn and Keller weren't momentary lapses. They were products of a selective filter, allowed to continue because they hadn't crossed the wrong line. Now they had gone too far, and this time the man tied to the pole was the reason. Malik could no longer look away, like those who came before him. The 8-page report, signed by Malik, was submitted directly to the disciplinary council early in the morning. It included a detailed account of the incident's time, date, and the names of the 2 involved officers. It called for their suspension and the initiation of a formal investigation. The final section was bolded, awaiting full verification of body cam footage. Do not release until the integrity analysis is complete. Malik personally delivered the hard drive containing the body cam data from the storage unit to the digital forensics department. The technician reported that the syncing process was slow and that several clips showed signs of cuts or overwrites, requiring more time to verify. Unsatisfied, Malik ordered a backup of the original footage directly from the device, bypassing any intermediary processing, and secured all copies under a personal access code. The original files from Keller and Dorn were isolated from the system and labeled pending integrity verification, not for release. Internally, everything followed administrative procedure, but outside, information began leaking in an uncontrollable way. An anonymous account with no profile picture or post history published a single line on a public forum. If the man tied up wasn't the police chief's father, would anyone have known what happened? No image, no video, no source. Yet the question spread like a fracture on glass. Beneath the post, a cascade of comments appeared. One woman said she saw an old man being stalked near a barber shop, and someone had recorded a video before walking away. Another recalled being pulled over by Dorn once, describing the encounter as terrifying even though she had done nothing wrong. Some disagreed, arguing the officers were doing their job and that no one knew what the old man might have said. The online community split into 2 sides. One demanded the video be released and the identity of the restrained man revealed. The other called to let authorities handle it, citing the right to confidentiality and ongoing internal investigations. Local media remained silent. No news aired, no articles published. But neighborhood forums and group chats began to fill with grainy photos and murmurs. Meanwhile, at the police headquarters, Malik received a message from the internal media office. They advised him to issue a statement soon to stabilize public sentiment. He sat at his desk, rereading the request for a prepared message. He declined, not because he lacked the words, but because he understood that a sterile statement would only widen the distance between the administration and the people. Instead, he opened his calendar, selected the next available time slot, and emailed the community relations unit. Organize an open meeting. Public access. Everyone's welcome. As he stood up, light from the window struck his shoulder, casting a long shadow across the tiled floor. The procedures were done, but the coming wave was rising from elsewhere, and this time he knew he had to face it not with paperwork, but with his real self. The Westfield Community Hall, usually a quiet venue for neighborhood gatherings, was unusually packed. Old wooden chairs were tightly arranged, with people standing along the walls or sitting by the windows, waiting to hear what the new police chief had to say. The air was heavy, as if the room itself held its breath for the first reaction. Malik entered alone. No entourage, no security, no lapel mic. He wore a dark shirt and carried a folded stack of papers, though he never opened them. He walked to the front row, but didn't take the podium. He sat beside the others. A few surprised looks, some subtle head shakes, but no one objected. The silence made the sound of his shoes echo clearly. He looked at the faces before him. There was an elderly man with crossed arms, a young mother with a baby sling, a college student with headphones draped around his neck, and a few familiar faces from past budget meetings. He didn't greet or offer a long introduction. His first words came in a low but firm voice. "Has anyone here ever been mistreated, but had no camera to prove it?" A thin silence swept through like a passing breeze. Then a hand went up. An elderly woman said her husband had been dragged out of their car while on his way to get blood pressure medication, just because their license plate was outdated. A brown-skinned student shared how he was pulled over without cause 3 years ago, his phone snatched away when he tried to record. No one interrupted. No one asked them to be brief. Malik listened to each story without taking notes, without offering counterpoints. The residents' voices filled the room, chipping away at the hardened wall that had long separated them from those wearing badges. A freelance reporter raised her hand. "What do you think about the fact that the man tied to the pole is your father? Is that why this incident wasn't covered up?" Malik looked directly at her without flinching. "I think it's unfair that blood ties are what it takes for wrongdoing to be acknowledged. No promises were made, no timeline commitments or flashy directives." He ended the meeting with a clear statement. "I didn't come here to smooth things over. I came to listen and to signal that we know this wasn't an isolated case." He stood, gave a brief nod, and stepped back toward the door. As the room began to empty, a man in a worn coat approached, his hand trembling slightly as he handed Malik a small, folded piece of paper. Without speaking, the man turned and walked away before Malik could do more than nod. On the paper was a scrawled name, Russell M. Gibson, with a note underneath, "Former officer, reassigned after filing internal report on abuse of power." Malik stared at the writing for a moment, folded it again, and slipped it into his inner pocket. The community meeting had ended, but a new door had opened, not about the 2 officers recently suspended, but about something this town had kept buried for years. And this time, he wasn't moving forward with his eyes closed. The Macon Community Center auditorium was wide and well lit, yet the air inside felt heavy, as if people were breathing through a layer of dust covering all the things left unsaid. The chairs were neatly arranged in horizontal rows beneath a blue banner with white letters that read, "Listen and Dialogue for Justice." Under the stark fluorescent lights, the faces of the officials sitting in the front row bore the tension they were trying hard to conceal. The first speaker was a local businessman, dressed in a light shirt, his voice composed and firm. He stated that the recent incident needed to be viewed in a broader context, and that we should refrain from judging the police before all the facts are in. Scattered applause followed from the right side of the room, mostly from unfamiliar faces, well-dressed, middle-aged white attendees. Another man, a former serviceman, claimed that the police's actions might have had legitimate reasons, even if not immediately apparent. His statement drew a few raised eyebrows, but no one interrupted. The entire hall seemed wrapped in a polite yet suspicious veneer. Each statement fell like a pebble into still water. No immediate splash, but subtle ripples remained. In the last row, a group of older black residents sat closely together. None of them raised a hand to speak, but their gazes spoke louder than words. One rested his hands on a cane. Another leaned slightly back, eyes fixed on the podium with a patience that bordered on resignation. They had been here before, heard similar promises, held hope long enough to know that sometimes silence is the only shield left. Malik stood on the left side of the hall, watching each speaker closely. He didn't frown or nod, just observed. His police uniform was neat, the badge on his chest muted against the dark fabric, as if he himself wanted to blur the line between role and identity. A member of the City Safety Committee was invited to the podium. He spoke clearly, methodically, in a tone steeped in bureaucratic familiarity. "The matter involving Mr. Isaiah Carter is being handled according to proper procedures. We have not yet found sufficient grounds to make public statements while the internal investigation is ongoing. Premature disclosure could damage the department's reputation and cause misinformation." Before the man could finish, Malik stepped onto the main platform. No introduction was needed. He walked straight to the microphone, eyes fixed on the speaker. Without raising his voice, he said something that cut through the room like a quiet blade pressed flat on a table. "If he weren't my father, would anyone know about this?" There was no anger in his tone, no dramatic pause. It slid out like truth, cold and clear. The atmosphere sank. The man above faltered, lips tightening. Even the sound of fingers tapping on tables ceased. The hall grew so still that a sigh from the back row became audible. Leek said nothing more. He stepped back from the microphone, letting the question linger. Somewhere in the hall, someone bowed their head. Not in shame, but because, for the first time, they were forced to wonder how many truths had been buried simply because the victim had no son who was a police chief. The silence that followed wasn't the kind typical of political forums. It wasn't forced, nor was it polite. It was the kind of silence that made the whole room constrict, confronting everyone with something they hadn't dared to think. In that pause, truth struck with every heartbeat, needing no repetition. The safety committee member remained still, paper in hand, his eyes scanning the rows without finding an anchor. Those who had earlier clapped in support of the police now sat still, their eyes dimmed. There were no counter-arguments, no further debate. The question wasn't meant to provoke, it was meant to awaken. An elderly woman rose on the left side of the hall. She wore a dark sweater, her graying hair tied back, her voice hoarse and trembling. "I once filed a complaint. My son was wrongly detained after a scuffle at the train station. I thought someone would respond eventually, but years have passed and no one ever called back. No one replied. No records needed checking." The truth in her words was unmistakable. The thin black man in his 50s, seated near the aisle, slowly raised his hand. He spoke about being stopped by police, having his bags searched without reason. "I didn't do anything wrong, just drove an old car and wore a low cap. They thought I looked like someone they were looking for." His tone was calm, not bitter. The story was short, but everyone recognized it as one of many dismissed, because there were no cameras or witnesses. Another man, tall and in a work vest, shared how he was held after a shift for suspicious behavior. He curled his lip slightly, not in a smile, but in weary defiance. His eyes made it clear he had once lost faith and was only now reclaiming his voice. A college senior followed, recounting being frisked 3 times in a month for walking through a wealthy neighborhood. No apologies, no record. Malik stood in the center of the stage. He needed no further defense. No files, no statistics. He had said what had to be said. The rest now belonged to those rising one by one, spurred by that single question, a question not meant to prove anyone wrong, but to reveal what everyone already knew and never named. The meeting ended without a formal close. No applause, no shouting, just slow footsteps leaving their seats, eyes not meeting but still understanding that they had all walked through some internal threshold. No winners, no losers. But something had clearly shifted. That evening, a local social media post circulated a clip of Malik's words. The caption spread rapidly. "If he weren't my father, would anyone know about this?" No headline, no commentary. Some reposted it with pictures of their own parents. Others left it blank, just the quote. For the first time, a question went viral, not to incite or rally, but to make readers remember the times they had sat in a similar room, heard an injustice, and chosen silence. And this time they asked themselves, if that victim were my father, would I have done anything differently? The press conference was held in a small room at the police headquarters, where soft yellow light reflected off the old tiled floor. There were no backdrops or banners. Malik stood behind a wooden podium, without any notes in hand, both palms resting on the edge of the table. His eyes were fixed on those seated before him, local journalists, community representatives, and a few others watching his every move as if reading between the lines. "I'm reinstating the Civilian Oversight Board," he said, voice calm but sharp, not to pacify public opinion, but to ensure we have a truly citizen-led mechanism with full independent access to all complaint records from the past 5 years. The room didn't erupt in noise. Instead, a heavy silence fell, as if someone had dropped something no one dared to pick up. The Oversight Board had existed years ago, but only in name. Under previous administrations, it served as a cosmetic list for year-end reports. No independent budget, no data access rights. This time, Malik didn't revive the old model. He personally selected the new members through public discussions. A former town treasury employee, a human rights attorney from a neighboring county, a retired judge from Atlanta, and an investigative journalist who had once been barred from government press briefings. Just hours after the list was announced, the city's evening paper ran an editorial under a vague headline, "Can Revisiting the Past Really Heal the Present?" On social media, city council members reshared the article with messages promoting peaceful dialogue and sustainable progress. In a closed-door meeting the next day, some questioned the stability of governance structures if sensitive records were to be reopened. Malik didn't respond publicly. He issued a directive demanding the transfer of all complaint files and internal reports from the investigative division within 72 hours. The order was met with immediate delay requests from the administration. Systems not yet synchronized, access permissions need verification, software security upgrades in progress. Each reason sounded valid on its own, but together they formed a foggy wall of obstruction. Naomi Graves noted bluntly in an internal report, "Resistance doesn't come from disagreement, it comes from habit." Malik quoted that line and attached it to a final deadline reminder. The next morning he received a cryptic message. The words lit up on his phone. "Don't turn family business into political gain." No number, no signature, just a period at the end. Malik read it, turned off the screen, slipped the phone back into his shirt pocket, and returned to the thick notebook open on his desk. He understood that when a system has been silent for long enough, even the first whisper is deemed too loud, no matter how soft it truly is. The atmosphere inside the police department began to shift daily, not through overt actions, but through prolonged silences whenever Malik entered a meeting room. Some officers who had once shaken his hand at the inauguration now offered only brief nods before turning away. Attendance at briefings thinned. Some cited sudden patrols, others sent messages with excuses no one bothered to verify. Reports were submitted hours late, sometimes a whole day, though no one openly defied any of his directives. The deeper Malik probed into the system, the blurrier the line between neutrality and hostility became. The local paper ran a commentary titled, "When Justice Becomes a Weapon." It subtly questioned whether Malik focused only on cases involving black individuals, implying he acted to heal personal wounds. The article wasn't direct, but skilled enough to plant doubt, leading to nods of agreement in coffee shops around the town square. Soon after, a young civilian board member, once a public defender, had an old file leaked online. A minor financial dispute from his college years was inflated into fraud accusations. The young man called Malik hesitantly, saying he'd step back not to derail progress. Malik didn't argue. He simply wished him strength and resilience. After the call, he drew a line in his notebook. "They don't need to destroy you, just make you give up." Naomi Graves stopped by his office that weekend with a new folder. She found Malik still reading through old complaints as if it were a ritual. She set the folder down and sat across from him. "Do you know what you're waking up?" she asked, voice neither mocking nor pitying. "Something they've pretended not to see for 2 decades. That's why you're the most unwelcome person in this town." Malik chuckled softly, not out of sarcasm, but because he knew every word was true, and unarguably so. He kept his work schedule unchanged, even stayed late on purpose. Every day he read at least 10 previously dismissed complaints, flagged inconsistencies, noted each involved officer, each moment swept under the rug. The pages piled up, not filed away in archives, but into a separate notebook labeled in black ink. The ones who knocked then pulled back their hand. On weekday evenings, most lights on the second floor of the headquarters went dark. Malik remained, alone in the quiet space. His shadow stretched long against the white wall, pulled more toward darkness than light. On the desk, the notebook lay open, pen resting sideways, ink still wet on the cap. He looked toward the glass window, where only tree shadows and dim streetlights showed. There was nothing remarkable, yet he remained still, quietly repeating the line from his very first report after taking office. Each word felt carved into the air. Justice isn't about being welcomed. Justice is about being heard. Early mornings in West Macon Park were rarely crowded. Dew still clung to the stone benches, the grass remained damp from the night, and the birds hadn't yet filled the sky with their chatter. Isaiah walked along the path that ran beside the low fence, hands in his coat pockets, his shoulder leaning slightly to one side. That gait was familiar, so much so that a few elderly people practicing Tai Chi in the distance only needed a glance to recognize who was approaching. But today, he didn't stop to greet them like he usually did. As he reached the turn leading to the clearing near the large oak trees, Isaiah paused for a brief moment, as if something had knocked his sense of direction off balance. Just a shadow beneath the bushes, a hidden spot he'd walked by countless times. This time, two figures emerged from behind the tree trunks. Black jackets, hats pulled low, movements crisp like trained soldiers. Before Isaiah could fully turn, a blow to his side forced him to double over. A hand shoved his shoulder sharply, knocking him off balance and dropping him to his left knee. Footsteps pressed into the grass with weight, then a gravelly voice whispered in his left ear, "Don't drag us down with you." There was no excess threat, no further warning. The two men retreated immediately, turning down a side path along the pond and vanishing. Isaiah remained on one knee, breathing evenly, hand pressing against the ground. When he rose, he brushed the dirt from his pants, straightened his coat, and walked toward the main gate, his pace slower, but his footing firm. Back home, he poured a glass of water in the kitchen, then stepped into the bathroom. A bruise had already darkened along his ribcage, running black and blue along the bone. He opened a drawer, pulled out a bottle of medicated oil, and gently dabbed it on his skin. No rubbing, no mirror check. His coat was hung back on the rack as usual, the wrinkles near the shoulder fading beneath the soft yellow light. Breakfast unfolded as always. Isaiah ate sparingly, drank a cup of hot tea, then sat with a half-read book. Children's voices echoed from the next room. Leo ran in, hugged his waist, and tilted his head curiously. "Why are you walking kind of sideways, Grandpa?" Malik stood nearby, his eyes scanning his father's movements. He said nothing, but stepped forward, gently lifted the edge of Isaiah's shirt. The bruise revealed itself like a jagged imprint of violence. Malik didn't ask. He just looked at his father, with an expression as cold and still as ice. Isaiah shifted slightly, adjusted his posture, then sipped his tea. His voice was calm, almost mocking himself. "Strong wind hit a little hard today." The words were short, not meant to explain or hide. They hung in the small kitchen, between the sound of dripping water and the invisible weight of a warning not yet named. Malik said nothing more, but later that morning, a blank line appeared in his notebook, reserved for something without proof, but already marked by impact. That evening, Malik spent hours reviewing footage from the surveillance system covering the western park. Every camera along the trail functioned normally, except for an 8-minute blackout that aligned exactly with the time Isaiah had been there. The server log displayed a simple message: storage incident, synchronization error. No one in the technical team could offer a reasonable explanation. To Malik, it wasn't a malfunction. It was a deliberate scratch in an otherwise flawless recording. He pulled up the technical logs, comparing them to a lawsuit that had been buried 2 years earlier, where a video failed due to the exact same error, also in a public area. The pattern was too precise to be a coincidence. He called Naomi that night, requesting a review of personnel who had worked in internal affairs during the previous term. No names needed, just patterns. Who had access to tamper with data processing, who had once been suspected but mysteriously retained. The next morning, Malik walked through the park, tracing each path, noting the timestamp on every camera and matching it to the physical site. An old man reading a newspaper by the koi pond looked up and nodded. When Malik gently asked about the previous morning, the man responded slowly, eyes still on the page. "Saw 2 strange guys, black hats, boots thick like military gear. Didn't talk to anyone, just walked fast and vanished behind the trees." Malik thanked him, wrote down the description, underlined 3 words: combat boots. The sense from last night, the grit at the back of his neck, was taking shape. This wasn't random. It wasn't accidental. Someone was sending a message, and Isaiah had become the medium. He didn't hold a press conference or file complaints. Those who strike from the shadows thrive when the spotlight points the wrong way. Malik chose differently. He changed every lock in his father's home, reset all window access codes, and installed motion sensors linked directly to his phone. Marlon was sent to inspect every electronic device, including the router, smart TV, and the old camera hub. He didn't ask why, he just said, "If you need me to stay tonight, I will." Malik opened his notebook and, with a black pen, wrote a single line: "They've moved to methods that leave no record." Beneath it, 3 arrows pointed to the system's blind spots: data, personnel, and finance, places where power doesn't show its face, only its command. That evening, in the living room, Isaiah sat, facing the half-open window. Garden lights cast a faint glow on half his face. He wasn't reading or watching the news. One hand rested on the armrest, his gaze fixed beyond the glass, at the tree where faded leaves rustled in the breeze. Malik entered quietly and set down a hot cup of tea. He said nothing. Isaiah didn't turn around. His voice floated back over his shoulder. "They don't hate you. They hate how you dare to name them." No further words were spoken. The night wind slid through the crack in the window, carrying the scent of fresh grass and the metallic hint of damp earth. The night stretched longer than usual, not by time, but by something quietly shifting behind walls, once thought unshakable. The morning unfolded like any other. Leo, with his red backpack, dashed to the school van waiting at the gate. Malik kissed his son's forehead and gave a few reminders before heading back inside to begin his workday, filled with back-to-back meetings. Isaiah leaned against the porch column, eyes following the departing vehicle, out of habit since Leo started school. By late afternoon, near the end of Malik's workday, a call came from the elementary school office. The voice on the line was tense. "Mr. Carter, Leo wasn't on the return van today. We've checked the roster. The driver confirmed he didn't see him leave the classroom." Malik stood up immediately, his face pale. He requested access to the school gate security footage, but the tech department reported a signal failure that had started around noon and was still being restored. An hour later, Leo's red backpack was found in a bush beside the school building. One strap had been twisted out of place, and the front was smeared with dirt and light scratch marks, as if dragged across damp grass. There were no clear signs of struggle, but an eerie unease rose in Malik's throat like a tidal surge. He issued an emergency alert, triggering internal protocols. The full tracking unit was deployed. Leo's photo was distributed to every checkpoint, every civilian intel unit. Yet no one called, no emails arrived, no ransom notes appeared. It was as if Leo had vanished like a shadow that left no trace behind. Isaiah sat on the bench behind the house, hands gripping the cushion's edge. The evening breeze swept through the rafters, carrying the scent of burnt grass. He stared at the empty yard where Leo usually played soccer every afternoon, then bowed his head silently. Sweat matted his silver hair, and his forehead furrowed with each shallow breath. When Malik entered, Isaiah didn't look at him right away. His voice was rough and slow. "They want to make me pay, with my grandson, because I turned down the money, because I refused to be silent." Malik said nothing. Isaiah took a deep breath and finally looked at his son, his gaze heavy with the weight of past decisions. "If you give up, this ends. Put me on trial. Admit it all. You'll keep the boy safe." Malik stood nearby, the overhead light casting his face in shadowed angles. The tendons in his neck were clearly defined. He didn't speak. His eyes stayed fixed on the window, where the porch light flickered in the night wind. His right hand still clenched the folder from that afternoon's meeting, the pages slightly bent from unconscious pressure. No words passed between them, no arguments, no agreement. Only a thick silence that both men understood had arrived, but neither was ready to name. And in that silence, a new darkness crept out from within the system, not loud, not violent, but it had already taken the most precious thing, not a life, but the belief that justice could still walk through mud and remain clean. Malik sat alone in his office, the glow from his computer casting light on his tense face. A new email appeared in his inbox, from an untraceable address. The subject line read simply, "Final Warning." He opened it, reading each word slowly as it appeared in the cold white box. "You don't know who you're dealing with. Stop now and the boy returns unharmed. No ransom demands, no conditions, just a direct hit on the deepest fear any father carries, the loss of a child." Malik sat frozen for nearly a minute, as if trying to read between the lines to see what lay beneath that composed menace. This wasn't a spontaneous kidnapping. This was calculated. Leo was not a bargaining chip. He was leverage. That night, Malik activated a special investigation unit. He called Naomi Graves back in. Naomi had once worked with Northern task forces targeting organized networks, but had taken leave to care for a dying relative. Her voice over the phone was clear and brief. "I'll be there in 2 hours." Malik offered no explanation. He needed action, not sympathy. Isaiah, upon hearing Naomi was being brought in, strongly objected. His voice rose, strained with fear. "The deeper you dig, the harder they'll press. You think they play by the rules? They don't have rules." Malik stood upright, eyes locked with his father's. The space between them wasn't bridged by words, but by the growing terror echoing in both their chests. That night, Isaiah didn't sleep. He sat in the dark living room, the lights off, pen in hand, and a blank sheet of paper before him. His handwriting was shaky but determined. "I, Isaiah Carter, admit to resisting law enforcement. I accept full responsibility for the consequences." The lines were broken, uneven, but the message was clear. He folded the paper, slipped it into a yellow envelope, and placed it on the table beneath a family photo from their last beach trip. The next morning, Malik found the envelope. He read it silently, then tore it into pieces in front of his father. Isaiah didn't speak, but his eyes welled with tears, and his throat tightened. He repeated the same sentence as if trying to hold on to something slipping away. "If we lose the boy, nothing else matters." Malik stepped outside as Naomi arrived. She didn't bring much, just a laptop, a signal receiver, and an external drive. He led her to the auxiliary data room where signals related to Leo had been temporarily stored. After 3 hours of scanning, Naomi found a weak signal coming from the tracking watch embedded in Leo's wristband. The coordinates pointed to an abandoned industrial zone on the town's eastern edge, a former steel warehouse from the 1990s. Malik looked at Naomi, then at the map. The location had no surveillance, no regular traffic, a perfect blind spot. But it was the first sign from Leo, the first step toward fighting back. Malik clenched his fist and nodded once, as if compressing all his fears into one decision. From this moment on, they would no longer stay passive. The closed-door session of the Disciplinary Review Committee was held in a small meeting room, separated from the main hall by a layer of frosted glass. Inside, members sat in a semicircle, papers spread out before them. Naomi and Malik sat across the table, silently observing the man who had just entered. Harlan, owner of the convenience store across from where Isaiah had once been tied, walked in with hesitant steps, his eyes scanning the room but avoiding contact with anyone. Weeks earlier, Harlan had emailed the police department confirming his presence at the scene and stated that he did not witness Mr. Carter acting in a threatening manner toward the officers. That message had served as a cornerstone of the internal report, helping Malik maintain the integrity of the investigation. But now, his official testimony before the committee carried a completely different tone. "I remember now," Harlan said, voice unsteady. He said something like, "You're making a big mistake." At that moment, I felt like he might try to rush at the officers. A few people in the room looked up. Naomi paused mid-sentence, her gaze shifting slowly from the transcript to the face of the man speaking. Malik sat still, hands clasped, chin tilted slightly, as if trying to process something left unsaid. The clerk repeated the question. "You confirm that Mr. Carter said or did something that made you feel unsafe?" Harlan nodded faintly, eyes cast down. "I think I got a little worried. Everything happened fast." Right after the hearing, the Civilian Oversight Council announced a delay in verifying Harlan's account, pending review of the store's security footage. But the recording system at the storefront had reportedly suffered a software malfunction just days after the incident, leaving no usable data. That announcement came barely an hour after Harlan's statement. immediately raising Naomi's suspicions. Isaiah heard the news while sitting on his porch. Malik arrived that evening with the updated report. Isaiah sat leaning against the wooden bench, eyes on the front lawn, his hand wrapped around a still warm cup of tea. As Malik read the new testimony aloud, he offered no reaction, asked no questions. "I want you to confirm one more time that you didn't do what they're now saying," Malik said quietly. Isaiah simply replied, "I told the truth. Saying more won't change anything." His answer left Malik silent for a while. He knew his father wasn't trying to protect his reputation. He said that because he had long learned to live with suspicion. To him, the truth didn't need vindication, only to be left uncorrupted. Naomi didn't stop at surface-level questions. She dug into Harlan's financial records. 3 days after the hearing, he secured a new contract with the largest grocery chain in the state, exclusive distribution rights in the southern region. The contract was signed by a regional manager who had served as a logistics officer in the same military unit as Travis Dorn 7 years prior. The documents Naomi gathered showed no clear sign of bribery, but the timing, the personal connection, and the economic gain were too aligned to dismiss as coincidence. She noted in her internal report, "Every silence has a price. Our job is to find out who paid for it." Back in the office, Malik reread Harlan's original testimony, the email that had once anchored the investigation. He held the paper longer than usual, then added a handwritten line at the end of the report. "The truth hasn't changed. Only its place in the room has." A day after the hearing, the local newspaper ran a front-page article with a bland but loaded headline, "Witness confirms words and actions may have led to police misinterpretation." The article didn't name Isaiah, nor did it mention the public tying incident, but everyone understood the implication. Harlan's account was quoted verbatim, accompanied by commentary from an independent legal expert stating, "In high-pressure environments, police reactions may sometimes be instinctive acts of self-defense." The comment section beneath the article was filled with questions, not overtly hostile, but enough to stoke doubt. "We weren't there. How do we know he didn't mutter something that got misinterpreted? If the police were completely wrong, why has he stayed silent all this time?" Malik sat at the press conference table that afternoon, facing a line of microphones and lenses. A young reporter raised a hand and asked directly, "Do you believe your father remained completely calm in that situation?" He didn't flinch. The response was short, clear, unwavering. "I believe what I saw in the original video, and I believe in the way he's lived his entire life." But belief didn't reach beyond that room. Public sentiment began to shift toward caution. Those who once spoke out for Isaiah now kept their distance, stopped sharing the article, and no longer sent messages of support. At the community center, where Isaiah used to spend time fixing bicycles and chatting with fellow veterans, he now stayed home, phone turned off, declining visits. If someone knocked, he would answer politely, invite them to sit, but his voice had softened, and his eyes no longer held anyone's gaze for long. In a private meeting with Naomi, Malik received a copy of Harlan's latest contract with a major regional distributor. Naomi provided a detailed breakdown. The agreement was signed immediately after Harlan changed his statement, granting him exclusive distribution rights within a 10-mile radius, an arrangement unprecedented for a small, independent store like his. There was no direct proof of bribery, but the logic was too seamless to be accidental. Malik sat alone in his office at dusk. Outside the window, the hallway light flickered in a slow rhythm. Inside, it was just him and a desk piled with case files. He reopened Harlan's initial testimony, a photocopy from that day's meeting. The handwriting was rushed but firm. "I saw Mr. Carter remain calm, never raise his voice, and didn't make any sudden movement." The paper's edges had begun to yellow. Malik set it down, took his pen, and wrote a final line beneath the investigation summary. "When the truth is pushed to the margins, the one who spoke it becomes the first to be investigated." He folded the file, eyes still lowered, not because he feared being wrong, but because he understood that maintaining belief in isolation sometimes requires more courage than standing before a crowd. The hearing room was packed that morning. Wooden chairs were lined up in precise rows, and local news station cameras stood along the aisles, ready to capture a moment many believed could be decisive. Malik sat in the front row, eyes fixed on the screen set to display the body cam footage, the video once hoped to be the final truth spoken by someone who no longer had the power to defend himself against the system. The head technician stepped up to the stand, placing a hand on the folder, voice steady as if reciting a memorized script. "We regret to inform you that the footage from Officers Dorn and Keller's body cams was lost during the transition to the new storage system. No backup remains, and the original devices have been reset as part of routine checks." A long silence blanketed the room. Malik stared straight at the technician, expressionless, but his hand tightened slightly. Members of the Oversight Council exchanged glances. Some took notes, others just sat motionless. The defense attorney moved quickly to seize the opening before the other side could respond. "No video, no audio, no verified evidence. All we have are emotional narratives." Isaiah was called to testify. He walked slowly, not stiff but heavy, as if carrying years long forgotten on his back. He recounted the event in an even tone, no dramatics, no embellishments. He remembered every gesture, every phrase, even the position of sunlight streaming past the utility pole. But from the review bench came questions laced with doubt. "Can anyone corroborate your story? Did you record it? Why didn't you report this immediately?" In the audience, some lowered their heads while others exchanged uneasy glances. No applause, no voices raised in support. The hearing closed with the weary rustle of court staff turning pages. Malik left the room with the same expression, but his eyes had changed. He saw clearly now how silence was returning, cloaked this time in legality and precision. By afternoon, headlines emerged across the media, insufficient evidence to confirm police misconduct. Some articles went further, questioning Malik's motives and using phrases like potential conflict of interest between him and his father, the alleged victim. Online discussions shifted. Former supporters withdrew, replaced by neutral queries like, could it have been a misunderstanding? Inside the Oversight Council, unity began to fracture. A few members suggested taking a step back for a more thorough review, while others pushed to slow the review of old case files to better allocate resources. That evening, Malik entered his office after the hallway lights had gone out. He removed his coat and sat in silence. A copy of the hearing transcript had been left on his desk. He stared at the bolded header, "Hearing suspended due to lack of verifiable evidence." It was the first time he had felt how heavy the word suspended could be. Yet in that silence, he knew one thing hadn't been erased: memory. And memory, if preserved long enough, always finds its way back. The meeting room on the third floor was full by late afternoon, but no one looked up when Malik entered. Some scribbled quickly in notebooks, others adjusted their collars, and the rest pretended to focus on their screens. His seat, placed in the center, felt emptier than usual. Throughout the meeting, every suggestion circled the same point. It might be time to reconsider. Since nothing clear remains to pursue, words were chosen carefully, volumes kept moderate. But Malik understood perfectly. The nods that used to mean solidarity were now merely formal. One legal advisor suggested, letting the system self-correct may be better than prolonging confrontation. The phrase was repeated twice, as if rehearsed. Malik took notes, but his pen stopped completely after that line. When he returned home, Isaiah was seated on the front porch, his figure bathed in the fading light. They didn't say much, but the look from his father said enough. Isaiah had never needed protection. What he needed was someone who would go all the way, someone who wouldn't turn away. Malik stepped into his study, didn't touch the new files, and instead opened the bottom drawer where he kept old complaints previously dismissed. Naomi Graves called late that night, her voice tense. She suggested revisiting the Central Tech Department to inspect the original data scan software, but the system returned an access error, citing internal security lock not yet cleared. Marlon, the technician who had once helped back up the data, also received a notice that his access to auxiliary storage had been temporarily revoked. Every effort to circle back was blocked at the same checkpoint where it had once been handled. The next morning, Malik arrived earlier than usual. On his desk was a small, folded note. The handwriting was neat, unsigned. "Is your career worth risking for this?" The words filled the room with a new kind of silence, not rooted in hostility, but in the slow spread of fear. That afternoon, he went to the archive room and reopened file after file previously overlooked. The pages had yellowed, ink faded, but some things time cannot erase. He stopped at a folder detailing a pilot program for backup body cam equipment, a minor project once launched in the town center. In the footnotes, a faint line read, "Fixed position device, May trial, not yet removed, pending evaluation." Malik circled the line in pencil. His hand gripped the folder's edge as his eyes fixed on the glass panel across the room. The late light angled through the window, landing squarely on the document he had just folded shut. The meeting room behind him was empty, the chairs unoccupied, but the space still felt taut, as if waiting for a declaration. No one said a word, but Malik understood. Every door he had knocked on was closing, and if there was any way left to break one open, it would have to come from the place no one wanted to revisit, from forgotten details buried deep in old archives and the quiet light streaming through dusty panes of glass. The cafe nestled quietly in an old corner of town, its glass door fogged with dust, its sign peeling letter by letter. Inside, a yellow ceiling light cast scattered shadows across the dark wooden table, forming patches of brightness like the fading memory of someone who had lived through too many winters. Malik sat at the last table in the far left corner, his hand never leaving the leather briefcase that held a stack of documents. He had arrived early, ordered a black coffee with no sugar, untouched, serving only as something for his fingers to hold on to amid the flood of unanswered questions. The door creaked open, a small bell rang once and fell silent. Naomi Graves stepped inside as if she belonged to the place, her posture upright, her eyes steady, scanning nothing, examining no one. She arrived on time, pulled out the chair opposite him and sat, without leaving a trace on the floor. Before Malik could say a word, she asked in a low, steady voice, "Are you ready to never look back?" Malik nodded, pulled out the briefcase and opened the neatly clipped folder. Inside were printed copies of interrupted data logs, a witness statement from someone named Harlan, and technical records from the IT department. Naomi flipped through each page soundlessly, scanning quickly yet carefully, her fingers moving as though tracing a hidden fracture. "Has anyone else accessed the event archive from that day?" she asked without looking up. Malik replied, "Only the internal tech team, a security supervisor, and the person who filed the initial report." Naomi paused at the third report, placed a finger on one line, and looked directly at Malik. "Marlon Tate?" Malik blinked, nodding slowly. Naomi repeated the name, this time with certainty. "He used to work for the state's backup data unit. He was once ordered to delete system logs and refused. He got away with it because his technical skill outmatched the person giving the command." Malik stiffened, his brows furrowed. Naomi closed the folder and leaned back. Her tone remained calm, but her words were sharp. "Anyone with the knowledge and guts to keep a copy is either reckless or someone who's already lost something more valuable than a career." Her phone vibrated in the pocket of her coat. Naomi pulled it out, swiped the screen, and made a call. She didn't look at Malik, nor mention who was on the other end. Once connected, she said plainly, "I need to see you again. That old thing still matters." There was no emotion in her words, no promises, but Malik knew from that moment on they were on the same side. A battlefield where loyalty wasn't tested by guns, but by the patience to wait for the truth to surface through the dust of the system. The data archive was hidden behind a row of aging government offices, its metal roof rusted, brick walls flaking, and the air laced with dampness. The side gate stood ajar. Naomi stepped through like someone who had memorized each step to avoid drawing attention. Inside, few people were working, just a few desks, old monitors, flickering fluorescent lights, and the tight, silent faces of young technicians, most of them wearing headphones. Marlon Tate sat at the last desk, eyes fixed on the screen, hands on the keyboard but not typing. He looked younger than he was, slim shoulders, narrow frame, high nose, and a furrowed brow. as if always bracing for an unpleasant call from someone more powerful. When he saw Naomi, Marlon rose slowly, showing no surprise. She didn't waste time. "I need to ask you about the backup log from that day. Event 172C. Marlon took a step back, voice low. "I don't have clearance to access files flagged as system errors." Naomi pulled up a chair beside the desk, eyes locked on his face. "I'm not asking for clearance. I'm asking your conscience." A quiet pause stretched between the sound of a distant fan and the tapping from another room. Marlon exhaled softly. "I saw the backup. It was just a buffer file auto-generated after recording ends. Then it vanished, but not due to a system glitch." He paused. "Someone intervened?" Naomi said nothing. Marlon sat back down, pulled a small silver hard drive from a drawer. "I copied it before the log was overwritten. I thought someone might need it, but I couldn't submit it." "Afraid of losing your job?" Naomi asked. Marlon nodded. "I was already warned once. That's all it takes to understand people like me only survive by knowing when to stay silent." Naomi reached into her coat and took out an old ID card. Its surface was worn, the print faded, but the words were still legible. "Federal Investigator, Independent Access Authority." She placed it on the table between them and let it sit. "I was once forced out for keeping a copy of a ruling a judge told me to forget. I lost my title, my pension, even my contacts. But I still sleep well every night." Marlon stared at the card, then into Naomi's eyes. He pulled out a small, unlabeled USB drive, its port sealed with clear tape. His hand trembled slightly as he placed it in hers. "If something happens to me, tell them I didn't delete this. I just didn't want it to vanish like the people who came before me." Naomi took the device and nodded without a word. She stood, walked toward the glass door. The outside lights cast reflections through the streaked pane, catching her face beneath a thin veil of dust. Passing cars sent bright lines across the surface, slicing her reflection in two, one side belonging to the past, the other ready to bring the truth to light. "Truth doesn't disappear," she said, turning back. "It just needs to be held long enough for someone to finally open it." The auxiliary room on the third floor of the Civil Review building was lit by dim fluorescent bulbs that cast a pale sheen on the scratched metal table. Every device inside was part of a sealed system with no network connections. The walls were lined with lead and thick insulation. The space was designed to ensure that nothing within could leak out, not even a ripple of data. Naomi placed a USB drive on the table and pushed it toward Marlon. He plugged the device into the machine and launched a data structure decoding program. Lines of code scrolled across the screen, interspersed with timestamps and compressed video frames. Tilting his head and furrowing his brows, Marlon's fingers moved swiftly before suddenly halting. "Someone tampered with it," he said evenly, though tension crept into his tone. "The footage was cut and spliced. They sliced through an audio data stream and replaced the missing part with blank samples." Naomi stood behind him, eyes locked on the flickering metadata. Each recorded frame carried a timestamp that should have aligned perfectly with the visual timeline, but in the middle section, the sequence broke abruptly. Marlon activated comparison mode. Two windows appeared side by side, the version on the USB and the official system copy. In the original, the numerical sequence flowed seamlessly from the moment Isaiah was restrained to when his photo was taken. The altered version lacked nearly 13 seconds. He zoomed in on each frame, from Isaiah's posture to Keller's hand movement. That missing interval should have contained clear audio and visual evidence of the most telling actions, but now it had been replaced with a repetitive blur. Naomi said nothing, arms crossed, her eyes fixed on the blank segment, lips pressed tightly together. Marlon resynced the audio. In the salvaged portion, Dorn's voice came through clearly, mingled with wind. "Send it to the guys at the station, this is fun." His words were crisp, punctuated. A laugh followed. It wasn't the kind that slipped out unconsciously. It was the sound of someone finding amusement in another's pain. The door swung open. Malik entered, his face taut but unreadable. Naomi didn't greet him or introduce anyone. She simply stepped aside so he could view the entire screen. Marlon didn't pause. He rewound the restored clip, pointing to the last visible frame frame before the cut. Isaiah's face looked straight into the camera, his eyes steady like stone. The frame froze for several seconds, sharp and unwavering. Malik studied it closely, his hand tightening on the edge of the steel table. No one spoke. The silence felt like something had just fallen heavily in the room, not with sound, but with enough weight to unsettle every breath. Everyone had their own reason for staying quiet, but all of it traced back to the same truth. Those 13 missing seconds weren't a glitch. They were intentional, and someone had made that decision with absolute clarity. Naomi turned to Marlon and gave a brief nod. Keep the structure intact, lock it temporarily, and export a certified copy. She didn't look at Malik, but her next words were directed squarely at him. We're no longer dealing with a case of deleted data. This is the deliberate distortion of testimonial evidence. Malik didn't move, his eyes still fixed on the screen. His back was rigid, chin slightly lowered, as if restraining something that had just pushed past the limits of his endurance. Without orders or declaration, that posture alone made it clear he would not stop here, and from that moment on, the game had shifted sides. Naomi sat beside the industrial printer tucked in the corner. The ceiling light reflected on the glossy paper as it printed each line of metadata. Every timestamp, every audio string, she reviewed with her eyes and a red pen. When the file was complete, she signed off on it. Original status intact, extracted directly, no interference since backup. This copy, she stated, would be submitted to the Independent Review Committee with a request to reopen the hearing based on newly uncovered evidence. Malik didn't return to the main office. He chose a small meeting room on the second floor, summoning the tech coordination team, a legal representative, and 2 deputy inspectors. The meeting was unannounced. The door remained closed, no nameplate displayed. On the screen, Malik projected the excerpted footage, rewinding to the removed moment, then letting the audio fill the room. Dorn's laugh cracked like a slap in the thick silence. A senior officer crossed his arms, speaking cautiously. I think we should handle this internally first. Avoid public backlash before we get clearance from above. Malik didn't respond immediately. He glanced around the table and placed a file down. Inside was a list of devices that had accessed data from Incident 172C, along with the names of personnel responsible for handling them. Starting today, all hard drives, workstations, and related logs will be sealed. Any unauthorized access from this moment forward will face criminal charges. His voice was calm but razor sharp. No one replied. Marlon stood at the back holding a schematic of the data flow. He raised it, showing the gap between frames, then played the same audio again. Send it to the guys at the station. This is fun. Dorn's voice came through, unaltered, undeniable. Naomi remained still, avoiding eye contact. She pulled out a printed copy from her folder, opened it to the first page. If this is buried for even one more day, I'll sign off to the media, along with a notarized testimony. Her eyes scanned the room. No one voiced support, but neither did anyone oppose her. Malik sat down, opened his laptop, and typed a command to reopen the case file, based on emerging evidence. Once encryption was completed, he signed the request and hit send. The screen blinked once, and a green glow reflected off his cheek. His final words, quiet but unmistakably firm, echoed across the room. From now on, this system will answer for every second. In the third-floor records archive room, Naomi stood among silent rows of metal filing cabinets, each drawer lightly dusted, the folder labels faded with time. She traced her fingers along a series of coded dates and applicant names, stopping at a file marked Dismissed, Insufficient Legal Grounds. The cover was yellowed, but the name on the complaint remained clear. Isaiah Carter. The file was thicker than she expected, filled with complaint copies, land parcel maps, and a few technical drawings. The contents detailed Isaiah's past accusations against a city council member for manipulating the Reconstruction Fund allocation for the Edgewater neighborhood, turning public land into a disguised private development. The individual named directly was Raymond Shaw, then serving as council commissioner in charge of the Southern District Planning. At the end of the file, Isaiah had handwritten a note. Ignore me if you must, but don't turn your back on the people who live there. Naomi brought the file back to the office and handed it to Marlin, requesting a full extraction of all internal emails related to the case. An hour later, he recovered a deeply buried folder using external tools. Among the restored data was an email titled simply, "Put it to rest." It had been sent from a Raymond Shaw office domain and instructed, "Do not process Carter's case. File lacks verification. Former personnel no longer assigned. Reassign the review to someone else. Prioritize close." The recipient was the Internal Affairs Chief at the time, now retired. Marlin looked up from his screen, eyes pausing with concern. Naomi tightened her grip on the file. Old fragments of data were beginning to align into something more alarming. Meanwhile, Malik received a report from the Perimeter Patrol Unit regarding a dark SUV parked near Leo's school for 3 consecutive days before the disappearance. The license plate had been partially captured by a residential surveillance system. A database search revealed the vehicle was registered to Foreside Equity Group, a financial management company. On paper, it was a real estate investment intermediary, but legal documents showed Raymond Shaw was currently listed as the firm's senior financial advisor. Suddenly, all the threads connected. Malik studied the Edgewater zoning map Isaiah had flagged 12 years ago, then glanced at the current ownership diagram. The land had since been subdivided and resold to subsidiaries tied to the Foresight Equity Network. He called Naomi into the conference room and asked her to compile every complaint file involving Shaw during his tenure. Naomi quickly found 3 more cases, all sharing one trait. Each was dismissed without a formal response from the handling agency. Coincidence was no longer plausible. Malik reviewed recent communication records between witness Harlan and attorneys authorized to access the precinct over the last 2 months. One name surfaced, Donald Greer, a former legal representative for clients linked to the Edgewater project during Shaw's time in office. Greer had held 2 private meetings with Harlan just days before the initial hearing. Harlan's change in testimony coincided exactly with those visits. Malik closed the file, resting his hand on its spine, eyes fixed on the name Raymond Shaw printed across the cover. Obvious offenders are dealt with swiftly, but the ones pulling strings from the shadows, shaping truth with authority, are far more dangerous. And this time, he wasn't going to let them hide behind curtains any longer. The 3rd-floor conference room in the old municipal building was sealed tight, the curtains drawn, yellow lighting casting a quiet glow over the long table at the center. Malik sat at the head of the table, eyes focused on Naomi as she placed the thick file before them. Each page was clipped and dated, tagged with time and location references, thoroughly cross-verified with the evidence Malik had waited weeks to secure. Across from them sat the state judicial representative, visibly cautious but visibly intrigued. Beside them, a neutral federal investigator took notes with clinical precision. Naomi opened her laptop and projected an audio recording onto the main screen. A deep, gravelly voice echoed with sharp resolve. "I don't need them locked up. I need them silent." No name was needed. Anyone who had worked under Raymond Shaw would recognize that voice. It had once echoed through executive meetings, silencing staff into obedience. Marlin stepped forward and placed the network access log on the table. The IP address was clearly printed. It matched the device used to enter the police system and delete body cam footage. The source IP traced directly to Shaw's former office network, while he still served at City Hall. This debunked every claim that the deletion was a system glitch or a technician's error. The federal investigator's expression darkened. He turned to Naomi and asked for verification of the audio's origin. Naomi responded plainly, "The device was deployed by our team. The voice is authentic, unaltered, with a sound signature matching 3 of Shaw's public meetings." The room fell into brief silence. Malik then stood and activated the second monitor. A transaction record appeared, detailing multiple fund transfers through intermediary accounts. The final recipient was a familiar name from a witness file, attorney Marvin Hurst, who once represented Harlan. the same witness whose reversal had cast doubt on Isaiah, Naomi pointed out. This account is directly linked to an illicit fund diverted from City Hall's budget 3 years ago, labeled as Emergency Operational Costs. No reconciliation report was ever filed. The state legal representative took notes, his face like frozen water. Everyone in the room was beginning to understand this wasn't just administrative misconduct. It was a calculated, long-running cover-up. Outside, Raymond Shaw began his counterattack. That same evening, he appeared on local television, calling all accusations political fabrications, accusing Malik of abusing power over personal vendettas and insisting he would not allow anyone to manipulate the very system he helped build. Malik offered no public response. Instead, he sat alone in a dimly lit room, the glow of a screen casting shadows across his face. Naomi's file lay open in front of him, pages nearly at their end. He turned another, his eyes resting on a forged signature, then looked up at the faint bulb above. "You can silence a lot of people," Malik said quietly, to no one in particular, every word drawing a line in the sand. "But this time, you'll walk into the light yourself." The hearing room had been completely rearranged. 2 additional rows of seats were added, and the sound system was tested 3 times before the session began. At the front stood the podium for the state justice representative and the oversight panel from the federal government. On the floor sat the citizens, media, and civil rights observers. The atmosphere was heavier than before, but the expressions of those in attendance were clearer. None of them could hide the weight of expectation. Malik Carter stepped out from the back of the room. His nameplate clearly stated his position, but his eyes didn't linger on anyone. He stood tall at the microphone, the spotlight casting sharp lines across a face marked by quiet endurance. "I bring only 2 things today," he said, "truth and responsibility." There was no long introduction, no attempt to justify personal emotion. He nodded toward Naomi, who was holding a remote control. On the large screen behind them, the video began to play. The image was clear. Isaiah Carter stood silently in the middle of the street, face composed, hands pulled forward. Keller was filming with his personal phone. A wide grin stretched across his face. Dorn stood in front of Isaiah, leaning down to tie zip ties around the man's wrists against a utility pole. There were no arguments, no resistance, and no justification for how he was treated. Each frame sliced through the air, silencing the room. A woman in the middle row gasped. A whispered, "Oh my God," was repeated. The police department's attorney stood up, trying to request a pause in the video, but the presiding official waved him off. "What we are discussing is evidence," the official said, "and dignity." The video continued until Keller, still smiling, held his phone up to photograph Isaiah from a short distance before both officers walked out of frame, leaving Isaiah alone in the street, like a wound exposed in broad daylight. When the screen went dark, the silence lingered for several seconds, as if everyone were struggling to remember how to breathe. Malik said nothing further. His eyes scanned the room and stopped at the legal representative's table. Isaiah was invited to speak. He rose slowly, shoulders slightly hunched from an old wound, but his voice did not tremble. "I've heard people speak of restoring honor," he began. "I've heard it enough to know that sometimes it's just a polite way of ignoring what was done." He paused, then turned toward the press, eyes steady. "I don't need an apology if it's only meant to calm the outrage." The words fell heavily over the room. No applause followed, no protest either. It was the truth no one wanted to hear, but everyone had to swallow. As Isaiah stepped down from the podium, a few in the room bowed their heads. Some representatives from the black community stood, nodding in his direction. Journalists began typing quickly, not to sensationalize, but to capture the whole moment, the full emotion, as if witnessing something finally worth preserving. From those who once remained silent, questions were now sent to the Civilian Oversight Board. On social media, the first post following the video was simple. "He stood still. What about us?" Malik remained in place, hands on the table, gaze unwavering. He understood that only a fragment of the truth had reached the surface. What lay beneath was what he refused to let rest. Naomi stepped forward, approaching the microphone with a printed copy of a recovered phone file. Her voice was clear, not loud, and without forced emphasis. "We've recovered an audio clip from Harlan's confiscated device. It records a conversation with attorney Marvin Hurst before the first hearing." The sound echoed through the chamber. The room was so quiet that one could hear the faint clicking of the projector. Harlan's voice, shaky, asked, "If I say this, are you sure I won't be charged?" Hurst replied, "Don't worry, the money went to the right places. One testimony buys peace for the whole town, and you'll get your cut." Beneath the calm tone was the stench of hidden handshakes and emergency funds no one had ever tracked. Naomi didn't stop with the audio. She projected a financial record on the screen. The funds moved from an internal municipal account to Marvin Hurst's personal bank. From there, a smaller cash withdrawal was made at a location near Harlan's store 3 days before his recanted testimony. The timestamps matched. There was no room for denial. Harlan sat frozen, hands gripping the armrests. His once animated eyes were now glassy and vacant. When the presiding official asked if he had anything to say, no words came. His attorney lowered his head, pulled out his phone, but no exit could be found through the rising tide of stairs closing in from every direction. A man in the back row slammed his hand on the railing, yelling, "So everything we believed was built on dirty money?" A young woman rushed out, clutching her purse, tears streaming down her face. The anger was not loud, but it was solid. Eyes once full of trust toward the police now turned inward, questioning everything. "So," he asked, his anger questioning everything. The presiding official announced that Harlan was to be taken into custody for perjury and ordered a full investigation into all internal decisions related to the incident, including the team responsible for managing body cam footage and the security oversight signatories. For the first time in years, the phrase, "review the entire process," was no longer a formality, but a directive with clear targets and deadlines. Harlan was handcuffed and escorted out in silence. No one shouted, no one clapped, and no one interrupted. The whole room stood still, watching as a long-accepted belief was peeled away. Malik remained seated, fists clenched beneath the table, eyes fixed on his father as Isaiah left the front row. Isaiah rose after it all. He did not look at the cameras, did not shake anyone's hand, and walked as slowly as ever. As he passed the large doors of the hall, he paused briefly, raising his right hand to touch his chest pocket, where he kept the faded veteran ID. For the first time in years, he felt it was finally respected, not for the past, but for the truth he never let go. The third-floor meeting room of Macon City Hall was quieter than usual. 6 members of the disciplinary council sat in a row, hands folded before them, eyes fixed on the large screen at the center of the room. The city attorney leaned toward the microphone and gave a brief opening report. "The case has been reopened upon request of the independent investigation. Supplementary evidence has been fully verified. We now invite the investigating party to present their findings." Naomi Graves stood up, her dark blazer neat, voice firm but not cold. She projected a recovered video clip obtained from a backup device used by the technical team, an unedited recording. The screen's glow illuminated the faces in the room as the footage played. Isaiah being pulled toward the utility pole, Keller laughing, Dorn leaning into the camera. Every word and laugh came through clearly in the original audio. The room fell silent in the final 10 seconds of the clip. Naomi turned the page and presented her conclusion. The system data had been deliberately deleted, exactly when a suspension order was issued. A technician reported receiving unusual instructions from Keller's direct supervisor, who later resigned abruptly. Complaint records from 2018 to 2022 against both officers were shown, detailing at least 7 suspected cases of abuse of power that had been overlooked during Dorn's time at a previous unit. No one on the council voiced objection. Some nodded slightly, others glanced at the clock and took notes. Malik sat quietly in the left-wing row, not in uniform, revealing no emotion. His hands were clasped, eyes fixed on the screen, as if measuring every second it took for his father's stripped honor to be restored with irrefutable truth. The council chair raised his head after reviewing the documents. He distributed the prepared voting slips to each member. One by one, the ballots were marked and collected. The result: 5 in favor, 1 abstention. The motion for permanent dismissal passed. Travis Dorn and Bryce Keller were officially terminated, and their files were forwarded to the prosecutor's office for 2 charges: abuse of power and deliberate falsification of investigative information. Some faces on the council grew heavy. They remembered past complaints swept aside under the guise of insufficient evidence or eligible for internal review. Today, every trace of that silence returned, like a sharp ringing in their heads. No one tried to defend themselves. At the end, the chair scanned the room and spoke, not loudly, but with clarity. The town of Macon will not allow a badge to shield systematic violence. Authority exists only when it is subject to oversight, and today we oversee it for those long left behind. No one applauded. Malik stood up and walked out of the room without looking back. It was a victory that needed no applause. It was marked by timely silence, the kind the system had lacked for years. That day, at the Macon Community Center, there were no flags hung, no banners, no loudspeakers. Chairs were lined up in even rows beneath warm yellow lights from an old ceiling that had witnessed many quiet meetings and sparsely attended memorials. Isaiah Carter arrived early, dressed in a dark blue shirt, placing his grandson in a seat near the back, eyes fixed on the wooden podium in the center. He didn't speak to anyone. Those who entered later recognized him, but no one dared interrupt or approach. When the last seat was filled, a man stepped up to the podium holding a microphone, his voice low and slow, as if every word carried years of weight. He was a former representative of the local Veterans Council, the one who had once denied Isaiah's request for support due to paperwork issues. At that time, no one read the complaint. No one replied to the letters. Now he stood at the front, looking toward the back of the room. Some people have given too much for a country that made them wait too long for a simple answer, he said, gripping the podium's edge. And sometimes the system isn't wrong because it's silent, but because it doesn't speak when it should. No applause followed. The room was so still that the wind brushing through the hallway outside could be heard. A clerk walked in with a pale brown envelope and handed it directly to Isaiah. It was an official apology from City Hall, with paperwork confirming mishandling in his administrative records, blue ink, and embossed seal. Isaiah took it, glanced inside briefly, then folded it and slipped it into his shirt pocket. He didn't stand, didn't speak, didn't say thank you. When his eyes met the clerk's, he gave a single nod, light, firm, final, as if marking something closed in his heart, nothing more. He stood up, took his grandson's hand, and walked quietly down the aisle. People began to rise, but no one spoke or blocked his way. The chairs shifted aside as if making room for an invisible path leading to the door. It wasn't an honor. It wasn't a ceremony. It was acknowledgement. Outside, Malik leaned on the railing, watching his father approach. He asked nothing, didn't look at the envelope. As they passed, he spoke quietly, a message meant only for the man beside him. I don't need their apology. I need their change. Isaiah didn't respond. But in that moment, his steps grew steadier, not because of the letter, but because his son was still moving forward, the way he had always hoped but never witnessed. Morning light filtered through tall trees along the park, casting thin beams over dew-covered stone paths. An old bench sat beneath a sprawling oak, where Isaiah Carter now rested, hand on his cane, eyes on the child ahead. Leo sat on the ground, shoes muddy, coloring a toy police car in mismatched patches of red and blue crayons. The boy didn't care for clean lines. He layered colors freely and giggled at the odd shapes they made. Isaiah watched, his gaze distant, yet softening. His finger twitched subtly on his knee, a habit from waiting for commands long ago. He He was no longer in a meeting room, no longer holding his posture. Here, he was a grandfather watching a child draw a car in a world he once believed held no more peace. Leo looked up and rested his chin on his knees. "Grandpa, what were you doing on TV the other day?" The boy's voice was innocent, clear. Isaiah paused, lowered his eyes, and smiled. "Not sure. Maybe they thought I was too old to ignore." Leo burst into laughter, tilting his face toward the sky. His laugh echoed through the early leaves, shaking off the fatigue still clinging to Isaiah's shoulders. Isaiah bent down to pick up a lost pen cap, placing it next to Leo's notebook, then gazed out toward the distant lake. Sometimes peace after chaos doesn't come from a verdict, but from the presence of someone who asks nothing. Leo didn't need to understand. He drew siren swirls over the car, added 2 dots for eyes on the wheels, and called it Grandpa's Truth Guard car. Isaiah chuckled, not because it was right or wrong, but because, for once, someone spoke of his past without accusation or suspicion. Sunlight spread across the ground. The air was clear enough that he could feel his own breath, free from the dust of hearing rooms, free from the tension of scrutiny. Footsteps approached. Familiar black shoes stopped on the grass. Malik had arrived, sleeves rolled, hair slightly tousled, no badge in sight. He said nothing, just nodded and sat beside his father, both men gazing at Leo. Dry leaves fell at their feet, rolling across the path. The silence between them was not awkward. It was an agreement. Leo kept drawing, unaware of the weight he was lifting from the 2 men. Isaiah glanced at Malik. In his aging eyes was a rare softness, not born of pain, but of belief, that something better was finally taking root. Not a restoration of image, but a foundation where those who came after wouldn't have to suffer the silence he had endured. Malik leaned forward, elbows on knees, fingers interlaced. The breeze rustled at his ear, like whispers from something long buried. He looked at his father, then back at Leo, flipping a page. "I thought, if I exposed the case, you'd be angry." Isaiah didn't turn. His eyes stayed on his grandson, now coloring a yellow police hat. He spoke slowly, clearly, each word firm. "I'd be angry if you stayed silent." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't encouragement. It was a line drawn between what is right and what must be. Malik turned, watching the sun-worn cheekbones of a man who had survived battlefields and social exile. He said nothing more, but something inside him settled, like a light rain after a storm. Isaiah leaned back, arms crossed. He began speaking, voice even, like reading from memory. "Back then, my unit was stationed out west. There was a young black recruit, really young. One night, he was accused of desertion. The next morning, they found him dead at the foot of a hill, beaten." He paused, then continued. "We knew he didn't run, but none of us spoke. Not from fear. We just thought our words wouldn't change a thing." Malik looked down, fists clenched. Isaiah turned to him, eyes steady. "But you're different. You sit in a seat that demands to be heard, and this time you used your voice at the right moment." Malik nodded slowly, chest rising. He let out a dry laugh. "Thanks, Dad, for not stopping me, even knowing I'd get dragged into something messy." Isaiah turned toward Leo, who was drawing the 3 of them on a bench. "I've stayed quiet more times than you know, and I was wrong. Sometimes silence born of fear is more dangerous than a wrong word." Malik raised his head, eyes lit with something between admiration and regret. He exhaled softly. "I promise Leo won't grow up in a place where truth hides behind commas." Isaiah didn't answer. He stood, walked toward Leo, who was coloring a red police hat atop a drawing of an old man. Isaiah tore the page gently, folded it, and placed it in his shirt pocket. No one asked why, no explanation needed. "Maybe you should return it. Wait until tomorrow. If it's from Leo, let's go home," he said, resting his hand on Leo's head. The 2 walked away, slow and steady, like time being returned after too much compression. Malik remained seated, watching them go. No anger, no triumph, just a single certainty left. What needed to be said had been said, in the right way, not by shouting, but by silence. That meant something. Morning light filtered through the tall trees lining the edge of the park. casting thin beams across the dew-covered stone path. An old bench sat beneath the shade of an ancient oak, where Isaiah Carter rested quietly, one hand gripping his cane, eyes watching the small child before him. Leo was sitting on the ground, his shoes slightly muddy, coloring a police car with red and blue crayons. The boy ignored boundaries, letting the thick strokes smear into each other, giggling as the messy shapes amused him. Isaiah watched his grandson with a faraway but softened gaze. His hand rested on his knee, index finger curling slightly out of habit, like he used to when waiting for commands long ago. He was no longer in a briefing room, no longer needing to keep his shoulders rigid. Now he was simply a grandfather watching a child draw a car in a world he once believed had nothing left that could be peaceful. Leo looked up, propping his chin on his knees. "Grandpa, why were you on TV the other day?" His voice was innocent, clear. Isaiah paused, lowering his eyes before smiling. "I'm not sure. Maybe they thought I was too old to ignore." Leo burst into laughter, throwing his head back toward the sky. His laughter echoed through the early leaves, shaking off the weariness that clung to Isaiah's shoulders. Isaiah bent down to pick up the cap of Leo's crayon cap, placed it back near the notebook, then silently looked out toward the distant lake. Sometimes the stillness after a storm doesn't come from a resolved investigation, but from the presence of someone who doesn't need to ask questions. Leo didn't need to understand what had happened. He drew the car with sirens shaped like spirals, then added 2 dots on the wheels for eyes, calling it the truth-guarding grandpa car. Isaiah chuckled softly, not because Leo was right or wrong, but because it was the first time someone referred to his past in a way that wasn't judgmental or suspicious. Sunlight had now spread evenly across the ground. The air was so fresh that for the first time Isaiah could feel his breath untainted by the dust and tension of hearing rooms, no longer burdened by scrutinizing stares. A figure approached, familiar black shoes stopping at the edge of the grass. Malik had arrived, sleeves rolled up, hair slightly tousled, no badge in sight. He said nothing, just gave a slight nod and sat beside his father, both of them gazing toward Leo. The wind stirred, and dry leaves rolled across the path. The silence between the two men wasn't awkward. It was an unspoken agreement. Leo remained absorbed in his drawing, unaware that he was preserving something precious for both of them. Isaiah tilted his head, quietly glancing at his son. In the old man's eyes there was a new softness, not born of pain but from the belief that the past was being replaced by something sturdier. Not an image being restored, but a foundation laid for others not to suffer the silence he had endured his whole life. Malik rested his elbows on his knees, hands clasped together. The morning breeze brushed past his ear, the rustling leaves whispering like a voice from something long forgotten. He glanced at his father, then back to Leo, flipping to a new page in his notebook. "I thought if I made that case public, you'd be angry." Isaiah didn't turn. His gaze remained on his grandson, now coloring a police hat with pale yellow. He spoke, slowly, clearly, not loud but firm. "I'd be angry if you stayed silent." The reply wasn't forgiveness or encouragement. It was a solid boundary between what was right and what was necessary. Malik tilted his head, eyes tracing the sun-weathered cheek of the man who had crossed battlefields and lived through years of being pushed into society's shadows. He said nothing more, but inside him something stilled, like a soft rain after a long storm. Isaiah leaned back against the bench, hands resting over his stomach. He began to speak, voice steady, like reading from memory. "That year, my unit was stationed out west. There was a young black soldier, just a kid. One night, he missed his watch shift, and they accused him of desertion. The next day, they found his body at the foot of a hill. Beaten." He paused, then added, "We knew he was innocent, but no one said a word. Not because we were cowards, we just didn't think our voices could change anything." Malik lowered his head, fists tightening. Isaiah turned, looking directly at him. "But you're different. You sit in a seat, forces people to listen, and this time, you used that voice when it mattered." Malik nodded slightly, his chest rising in a long breath. He gave a dry laugh. "Thank you for not stopping me, even though you knew I was stepping into something I might not get out of." Isaiah leaned forward, watching his grandson sketch the three of them sitting on the bench. "I've stayed silent more than you know, and I was wrong. Sometimes, silence born from fear is more dangerous than words spoken in error." Malik looked up, his eyes catching a flicker of admiration and regret. He exhaled quietly. "I promise I won't let Leo grow up in a place where the truth has to hide behind commas." Isaiah didn't answer. He stood, walking slowly toward Leo. The boy was shading a red police cap over the head of an old man in his drawing. Isaiah leaned down, gently tore the page, folded it, and tucked it into his chest pocket. No one asked why. No explanation was needed. "Let's go home," he said, resting his hand on Leo's head. The two walked toward the familiar path, slow but steady, like time returning after too much compression. Malik remained seated, watching them go. There was no anger left in him, no pride, only a quiet certainty. What needed to be said had been said, in the most honest way possible, not with shouting or rage, but with silence that meant something. The morning at the town headquarters unfolded with a semblance of routine, but the atmosphere had clearly shifted. As Malik Carter entered the hallway, a few staff members greeted him with polite expressions, though their eyes avoided direct contact. He gave a brief nod and headed straight to his office. Since the incident where Harlan had been handcuffed in front of the press, an unusual quiet had settled across the station. There was no overt resistance, but no one lingered after hours to talk anymore. In his familiar office, Malik opened his drawer to retrieve notes for the morning briefing. He froze upon spotting a small yellow envelope placed among the files. It bore no sender's name, no postal stamp, no sign of internal routing. Inside was a single handwritten line, neat and precise. "What is brought into the light can also be extinguished. Watch out for Leo." Malik stared at the words for a long moment. His hands didn't tremble, his expression unchanged, but his gaze grew markedly colder. He stood and summoned the internal security team to his office within 5 minutes. His first request: pull all hallway camera footage starting from dawn. Second, audit the entry log, including cleaning staff. Shortly after, the footage revealed, a janitor entering the administrative wing before official hours. No one noticed. The person wore a mask and hood. The entry card used was a temporary pass, registered under a short-term contract that had ended 2 weeks earlier. When asked whether the matter should be escalated and security tightened, Malik shook his head. "No need to make it public, but from now on, every item on my desk gets checked before the doors open." He pulled out his phone and dialed his father. Isaiah picked up after 2 rings. Malik didn't explain much, just asked him to keep an eye on Leo for a few days, preferably not letting the boy go to school alone, even for a few minutes. Isaiah didn't question, simply replied with a short, firm, "Understood." That afternoon, Malik met Naomi at their usual spot near City Hall. He placed the note on the table. Naomi glanced at it, not bothering to touch. "Unsigned," she noted. "That's the kind of warning that comes from people used to giving orders without needing names." Malik didn't argue. He folded the note and tucked it into his jacket pocket. Naomi squinted slightly. "What are you going to do with it?" Malik answered plainly, "Not turning it in, not yet. I want to know who it is before he thinks I'm scared." They sat in silence for a while. The coffee in their ceramic mugs grew cold. Outside the window, a breeze rustled through the trees, sending down the last red leaves of the season. Neither of them said the word threat, but they both understood. This was no longer personal. It came with the role, with choosing a side. No one forced them, but once chosen, there was no retreat. Malik ran a finger along the rim of his cup, his voice deeper now. "I know the price, I just won't let anyone else pay it for me." An unscheduled meeting was called right after lunch. The third-floor conference room wasn't on the internal calendar. No reporters, no aides present. Malik walked in and recognized familiar faces from the town council and the Department of Justice, though their expressions had changed. No one smiled. No one offered greetings. A sheet of paper was slid toward him. Its title brief: Request for Justification Regarding Data Access by Unauthorized Personnel. An older member leaned forward, his tone deliberate. We need to understand why investigator Naomi Graves accessed internal systems without signed approval from the Central Administrative Office. Another chimed in, and why a video not yet legally verified was presented to the public as official evidence. Malik showed no resistance, no evasion. He simply stated, when the system refuses internal review, I have to find alternative tools. The answer pleased no one. Some crossed their arms. Others turned away. It felt as if they weren't looking for errors, but excuses. In the days that followed, a series of administrative audits were launched. The state police demanded a review of all data handling procedures related to the Harlan case. A leaked report hit the local press with a provocative headline: Chief Carter using power for personal agenda. At the command level, orders from Malik's office began to experience delays. Responses became standard, pending procedural review, awaiting additional sign-off. He realized he was being surrounded by compliance, legal shields for silent resistance. During an internal meeting, Malik didn't raise his voice or issue challenges. He simply placed a hand on the table and let his eyes sweep the room. Those staying, keep working. If you've lost trust, feel free to leave. Those who had stood by him through the Isaiah case remained seated. Naomi leaned against the doorway, holding a stack of documents. As the meeting ended, she walked over. If you want to keep the chair, you can't just sit in it, Malik replied without looking up. I'm not keeping the chair, I'm keeping the reason it exists. That afternoon, he returned to his office and began tidying up his desk, a ritual to clear his thoughts. From an old drawer, he pulled out a plastic-sealed photo: Isaiah, Leo, and himself, captured on a summer afternoon in front of their house. Once hidden behind stacks of files, the photo now sat on the desk beside classified documents. No one asked why. No explanation was needed. It wasn't for decoration, it was a reminder to himself that every form of power comes with a cost, and not all costs make people back down. He didn't need unanimous support, just enough reason not to retreat. And that photo was his reason today, quiet, unspoken, but heavier than any meeting, with or without minutes. The third floor of the Macon Police Department used to house old case files, stored in heavy wooden cabinets with rusted handles and faded nameplates. Few ever stepped foot there, and fewer questioned why records were preserved but never touched. Malik entered that space with a list in hand, outlining 87 investigations suspended over the past 5 years, most marked with vague notes: lack of evidence, not feasible, closed by directive. He didn't go alone. Naomi Graves led the review team, joined by Marlon, a technician known for recovering data from wiped devices. They divided the room, cross-checking file codes with the internal surveillance registry. Within a week, they uncovered dozens of cases that never passed through the Civilian Review Board, a step that was legally required. Some intake dates had been altered. Others had vanished from the digital archive, even though hard copies still sat in the cabinets. Bragg had what she called an off-season intake dates. If a client's holidays were caught and taken, they wouldn't have any intake, let alone hard copies still sat in the cabinets. The names of those once quietly dismissed began to resurface on the desks. A middle-aged woman who once filed a complaint about her son being beaten in a holding cell was contacted again. A construction worker, pulled over after his shift and left with a broken arm, was invited to recount the full incident. A young man who had been stopped 3 times while riding his bike through an affluent neighborhood had no official record because no harm was caused. Malik kept both the media and the city council at a distance. Every case was handed directly to the Civilian Oversight Board for a fresh evaluation. He made no conclusions and gave no press statements. What he sought now wasn't publicity, but process. Those who had once written complaints out of exhaustion and despair entered the newly opened hearing room with a strange sense of unfamiliarity. Gone were the stamped administrative letters. This time they received direct phone calls from board members, confirming convenient times and offering transportation if needed. They were greeted not with ceremony, but with calm eyes and a glass of water before the first question was asked. No one asked them why they hadn't spoken up earlier. earlier, why they lacked evidence, or why they hadn't cooperated more back then. The first words each person heard were, "What happened to you?" The room grew quiet with every testimony. Some spoke while trembling. Others remained silent for minutes before their voices emerged. Many shared nearly identical experiences of how the police had once used power to bury complaints, erase records, or shift blame due to lack of cooperation. Some cried, not out of anger, but because, for the first time, someone was willing to sit still and listen all the way through. Naomi recorded every detail, while Marlon began reconstructing event timelines from raw data. What once seemed like scattered fragments slowly formed a new picture. Malik, observing from behind the glass in the monitoring room, no longer looked weary. His gaze was focused still. He knew this wouldn't earn him favor. He might even be accused of dredging up the past, but this was the work he needed to complete before asking anyone to believe the badge on his chest still meant something. The third hearing that week opened with testimony from a woman in her 60s. Small in stature, hair tied in a bun, voice hoarse. She stood before the board holding a photocopy of a complaint she had submitted 3 years ago, the ink now smudged. In the original proceeding, she had been coerced into signing a statement that her son had inflicted the injuries on himself while in jail. The officer she accused had already retired, and the file was closed within 48 hours. This time, she didn't read from a page or lower her head. I stayed silent because I thought no one would listen. But now, I want to speak. Not to accuse, but so no one else has to be silenced like I was. As she left the witness stand, cameras began to turn. These hearings were no longer seen as procedural formality. The room was full, including people who once saw these spaces as useless. The stories began to spread through social media, small newspapers, even reaching those who had once seen everything but never dared to speak. An older man stepped forward next, bald, frayed collar, a deep scar still visible on the back of his neck even after nearly 20 years. He looked each board member in the eye and spoke evenly, without raising his voice or shedding a tear. "I don't need an apology. I just don't want anyone else to go through what I did." The board's demeanor began to shift. They no longer interrupted with follow-up questions or displayed skepticism. They let each witness speak without being cut off, took thorough notes, cross-referenced every clip, every document. A new member was added, a retired law professor, who requested the re-extraction of 8 body cam segments from previously closed cases where no misconduct was found. Malik attended every session, but he never sat in the center. He chose the last row, took notes by hand, and studied every pause and expression from those who testified. He gave no comments, issued no instructions, and didn't interfere in deliberations. His presence wasn't authoritative. It was a living promise that those once pushed aside were now being brought into the center. The atmosphere in the civilian board no longer smelled of protocol. It began to resemble a space for healing, though not one based on forgiveness, but on the right for truth to exist. People entered with hesitation, but left standing straighter, with clearer eyes. The files that once existed solely for storage were now being opened to correct, to reflect, and to learn. At the end of that week's session, a board member, a former investigative journalist, stood to speak briefly. "This is not a campaign to sanitize records," he said. "This is how people who were once treated as invisible learn they were never worthless." The words weren't directed at anyone in particular, yet everyone in the room understood. In that solemn silence, Macon, a town once heavy with suspicion, was starting to learn how to listen not with ears, but with actions. Old scars were telling stories, and this time, someone was writing a new ending. The small hall in the Southern Macon Community Center still held its worn wooden chairs and a tiled floor marked by time. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long beams across the faded shirts of veterans who had survived many wars. Each person sat with a different posture and expression, but their eyes shared one thing: silence worn into habit, yet never erased. Isaiah sat in the last row, close to the wall. His hands rested on his lap, fingers interlaced, the cracked skin around his knuckles still visible. His gaze pointed toward the stage, though unfocused. Soft whispers moved through the room. A few people recognized him and nodded. Some reached out slowly to shake his hand, a wordless gesture of empathy. No one spoke much. They didn't need to. Those who had once stood shoulder to shoulder at the edge of life and death understood there were things that never required words. A young woman from the organizing team stepped up, holding a microphone and reading out the names of attending veterans. When she reached Isaiah's name, few sparse claps broke the air. She invited him to the stage to share, her tone full of respect. Isaiah gave a slight shake of the head, instinctively refusing. She nodded and passed the microphone to someone else. The event continued with a slideshow of old photos, faded prints from newspapers, faces that were once youthful now sitting still below, hair white, hands trembling, but their chests still stirring when the sound of a military march echoed faintly through the speakers. 10 minutes passed, and Isaiah hadn't looked away from the screen. The images of the battlefield reminded him of a fallen friend, Corporal Ellis Monroe, who had taken the final bullet to save him during an ambush. The room blurred, replaced by memory. He remembered the cold rain on the day of Ellis's funeral, the mud, Ellis's wife standing still as stone. He approached her, held her hand, and said nothing. They gripped each other tightly, as if letting go would bury part of their memory along with the earth. The coordinator's voice called out again. "We know Mr. Carter is here and his presence carries special meaning. If he's willing to speak, we believe everyone here will listen with their hearts." The room fell completely silent. No clapping, no urging, only the eyes were turning toward the last row. Isaiah inhaled deeply. He didn't look at anyone, didn't show emotion. With a simple movement, he stood, stepped into the aisle, and walked toward the old wooden podium. Each footstep echoed off the floor like taps on memories long buried. No one spoke. No one raised a phone to record. The old soldiers only leaned forward slightly. They were waiting for something not crafted for politics, not shaped for the media. The podium stood a few steps above the floor. Isaiah placed his hand on its worn edge. No bow, no formal greeting. The room already told him one truth. Sometimes the truth is best heard in absolute silence. He stood firm before the podium, shoulders relaxed but steady. His eyes swept across the rows below, pausing at a few faces still carrying traces of old battlefields. Faces aged, but contemplative lines remained sharp. He didn't glance at any cameras or the ceiling. When he began to speak, he looked at real people, each one, every gaze. "I'm not standing here to talk about me," he said, voice low, each word drawn from somewhere deep. "I'm here to talk about how we've gotten used to silence. Not a sound intruded, no chairs were shifted, and no one cleared their throat. That silence mirrored the instincts of those who had once heard gunfire and didn't flinch." Isaiah continued, "We've seen our friends wounded, lost, some right in our arms, but when we came back, we witnessed a different kind of loss. Loss of dignity, of worth, of the chance to live with decency. Just because of skin color or because they lived in the wrong place at the wrong time." His face didn't change, but his gaze grew sharper. "I don't need those who hurt us to kneel. I need the next generation not to be treated as I once was." Another pause. Someone in the corner swallowed hard. Isaiah didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Some incidents get recorded, then shared, then condemned, but I lived in a time when there were no cameras, no recordings, no memories. Some were beaten by highways, sent into camps without records, quietly erased. Those stories were never told, and no one protected them. He paused again, his hand still on the podium, palm now tightening. We tell ourselves injustice is something naturally born from the system. It's not. Injustice survives because people choose to look away, choose silence, choose to wait for someone else to speak up. A breeze slipped through the window, rustling the side curtain. Isaiah looked down at the front row, where an elderly woman sat upright, hands on her cane, eyes brimming with tears, yet unfallen. He looked farther back, where a few younger attendees scribbled notes, nodding slowly. And when it happened to me, people paid attention because of who my son is. I know that. But what about those who have no one famous to protect them? Are we going to forget them again? His voice didn't rise, but its depth struck into the quiet churn of thought beneath dozens of white-haired heads. I've lost a lot, but never the ability to choose what's right. And I believe everyone here, if you've ever worn the uniform, ever held a weapon beside a comrade, then you know what right looks like. Isaiah stopped. He added no final words. Just a gentle nod, then turned and stepped down from the podium. No one clapped. For a moment, everything stood still like a heavy stone pressing on the air, until a boy in the back row stood. He bowed his head, said nothing, did nothing else. A quiet, resolute bow. Applause followed, not in unison, not flashy, not led by anyone. It moved from the back of the room to the front, slowly, one clap at a time, not by command, but by conscience. The story of Isaiah Carter is not just about the journey of a father who was humiliated or a child turned into a pawn, but it is a profound reflection of how society judges people based on their outward appearance, skin color, age, or social status. There was a time when he was tied to a utility pole like a criminal in the middle of the street, yet the truth was that he had risked his life defending this country. This shows us, never rush to judge someone based on prejudice. The value of a person does not lie in how others see them, but in how they stand firm in the face of injustice. Malik, a son, a young sheriff, chose not to remain silent, but to walk directly into the eye of the storm to protect the truth. He didn't act just for his father, but for the hundreds of others who had been treated unjustly, without cameras, without a voice, and without a chance. From a personal tragedy, the story unfolds a greater lesson. Justice is not something easily attained, but it always finds its way when someone brave enough opens the path. No one is too small to make a change, and sometimes the very people who are overlooked carry within them the power to make the system bow. Have you ever been judged wrongly, simply because someone didn't understand you? Have you ever been underestimated, yet silently proved you were better than they thought? If this story made you reflect, share it so that more people can learn from it. Perhaps someone out there needs a reason to stand up, to not give up on their self-worth. Thank you for watching. We hope to continue bringing you honest, inspiring, and unforgettable stories. See you on the next journey. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories.